I woke up to the insistent buzzing of my phone on the nightstand, a sound that jolted me out of a groggy sleep. It wasn't my alarm, and I wasn't expecting any calls at this ungodly hour, so confusion hit me first, followed by a flicker of unease. Fumbling in the dim light, I grabbed the phone and squinted at the screen. A notification from my security camera app glared back at me. Motion detected. My heart skipped a beat as I rubbed sleep from my eyes. I hadn't ordered any deliveries, and it was far too early for random visitors. With a mix of dread and curiosity, I tapped the live feed, and what I saw made my stomach drop. A massive concrete barrier stood smack in the middle of my driveway, an absurd, immovable wall where my car's path should have been. I shot out of bed, pulse racing, my mind scrambling to make sense of it. My car was still in the garage, which meant I was now trapped, caged in my own home by some lunatic who'd poured and set an entire block of concrete overnight. Panic quickly morphed into fury as I threw on clothes and stormed outside, the cold morning air hitting me like a slap. The sun was just peeking over the rooftops, casting an eerie shadow from the blockade across my yard, and I stood there, staring at it, trying to wrap my head around the sheer insanity of what I was seeing. That's when I noticed her, Karen, my nightmare neighbor, standing across the street with her arms crossed and a smug smirk plastered on her face. She was the self-appointed queen of the HOA, a blonde, bobbed tyrant who'd made my life hell since the day I moved in, and now she looked like she'd just won the lottery. Even at this hour, she was dressed like she was heading to a power brunch, her attitude as sharp as her haircut. "Good morning, neighbor," she called out, her voice dripping with fake sweetness that made my skin crawl. "I see you've noticed the new addition to your property." I marched toward her, fists clenched, barely containing the rage bubbling inside me. "Are you out of your mind? What is this? Who did this?" I demanded, my voice shaking with disbelief. She sighed dramatically, like a mother explaining something obvious to a dim-witted child, and waved a manicured hand. "Oh, it's a compliance measure. Your driveway was technically an unauthorized extension onto community property, so the HOA decided to correct it." I blinked at her, my brain short-circuiting as I tried to process the lunacy of her words. "An unauthorized extension? Karen, this is my driveway. It's been my driveway since I bought this house." She shrugged, unfazed. "Not according to our updated community guidelines. See, it extends a few inches past the regulated boundary, and we had to take action to ensure uniformity." My blood pressure spiked as the reality sank in. She'd orchestrated this madness to spite me, and now she was standing there gloating about it. "You blocked me in, my car, in the garage. How am I supposed to leave?" I shouted, my voice echoing down the quiet street. Karen let out a theatrical gasp, feigning concern that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh dear, that does sound inconvenient, but not to worry. You can always park on the street. It's not like you need a driveway anyway." My fists itched to punch something, preferably that smug expression off her face, but instead I pointed at the concrete monstrosity. "You had no right to do this. Who even approved it?" She held up a stack of neatly printed papers and shook them at me like a taunt. "The HOA board voted on it. It's all official. And before you ask, yes, I led the initiative. You're welcome." I wanted to scream. This had to be illegal, some kind of sick joke. But as I stared at the solid block imprisoning my car, I knew it was real, and Karen was loving every second of my misery. I stormed back inside, my mind spinning like a tornado as Karen's smug face burned into my memory. This wasn't just absurd. It was a full-on assault, and I wasn't about to let it slide. Grabbing my laptop, I threw myself onto the couch and started digging through the HOA regulations, determined to find something, anything, that could undo this nightmare. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up bylaws and fine print, but the deeper I went, the worse it got. The HOA had every angle covered. According to their rules, modifications made in the interest of community uniformity and safety were enforceable without prior homeowner approval. Since they hadn't technically altered my property but corrected an alleged violation, they'd slipped through a legal loophole so tight it made my head hurt. Frustration boiled over, and I slammed the laptop shut, the thud echoing in the quiet house. This wasn't just about a driveway anymore. It was about power, and Karen had been itching for a reason to flex it ever since I refused to kiss the ring of her little HOA cult. She'd found her excuse, and now she was turning my life into a living hell. Hours slipped by as I paced the house, making frantic calls to the city legal hotlines, Anyone who might have the magic bullet to blow that concrete monstrosity out of my driveway. But the responses were a monotonous chorus of defeat. It was an HOA issue, they said, and if I wanted it gone, I'd have to appeal to the same corrupt board that had greenlit this insanity in the first place. A board that was undoubtedly in Corinne's pocket, stuffed with her loyal minions who'd nod along to anything she decreed. By afternoon, I'd hit a wall, exhausted every option short of renting a jackhammer and facing whatever fines they'd slap me with. Defeated, I sank onto my porch steps, staring at the blockade like it was mocking me personally. That's when Tony, my laid-back neighbor, strolled over, skateboard tucked under his arm. He took one look at my face, then at the concrete, and let out a low whistle. "Damn, man, that's next-level petty," he said, kicking his board up into his hands with a grin. "What are you gonna do?" I let out a humorless laugh, shaking my head. "I've got no idea, can't remove it, can't fight it, I'm just stuck." Tony scratched his chin, eyeing the concrete slab with a thoughtful squint. "You know, that's a pretty smooth surface," he said, tapping his skateboard against his leg. I glanced at him, confused. "What?" His grin widened, a spark of mischief lighting up his eyes. "That's a perfect skating spot. No cars, no interruptions. If they won't let you use your driveway, why not turn it into something better?" The idea hit me like a lightning bolt, cutting through the fog of frustration and helplessness. My jaw dropped as I stared at the slab, seeing it in a whole new light. All that anger, all that powerless rage, it melted away, replaced by something dangerous, something brilliant. A slow grin spread across my face as I turned to Tony, adrenaline surging through me. "Tony, I think you just gave me the best idea I've ever had." The plan took root faster than I could process. If Corinne and her HOA goons wanted to block my driveway, I'd turn it into something they couldn't control, something that'd drive them up the wall. A skate park. The more I thought about it, the more perfect it seemed. They'd handed me a flat, solid slab, and instead of fighting a losing battle, I'd use their own rules against them. I just had to make sure it was airtight. The idea of turning Corinne's spiteful concrete slab into a skate park consumed me, and I dove into action with a fire I hadn't felt in years. First, I had to make sure it was legal. Corinne wasn't going to let this slide, and I needed to be bulletproof. I spent hours hunched over my laptop, researching local regulations and HOA bylaws, my eyes burning as I scoured every line for a loophole I could exploit. The HOA had ironclad control over permanent changes to my house's exterior, but I struck gold with a clause about temporary recreational structures. As long as it wasn't fixed in place and didn't block traffic or property access, they couldn't ban it outright. And since they'd already sealed off my driveway, there was no access to obstruct. It was a loophole so perfect it felt like fate. My grin widened as I scribbled notes. This was my way in, a middle finger to Corinne's tyranny built on her own rules. I called Tony and laid out the plan, my voice buzzing with excitement. He was on board instantly, not just because he lived for skating, but because he despised HOA nonsense as much as I did. "I've got friends who'll help," he said. "Give me an hour." True to his word, Tony showed up with a crew of skaters who shared his disdain for overbearing rules. They piled out of beat-up vans, boards in hand, and took one look at the concrete barrier before their eyes lit up. "Ramps, rails, grind boxes, this is a blank canvas," one of them said, already packing the slab like an artist with a vision. The energy was infectious, but I held up a hand. Step one was locking this down legally. The next morning, I filed for a local permit under the classification of a temporary recreational personal use structure. The paperwork was a breeze, and by noon, I had official approval stamped and signed. It was legally recognized, meaning if Corinne tried to sick the city on me, they'd have no grounds to shut it down. I made copies of the documents, tucking them away like ammunition. I knew I'd need them soon. By the time I got home, Tony's crew was unloading supplies. Wooden ramps, grind rails, plastic barriers to shape the layout. The air crackled with anticipation. This wasn't just about skating anymore. It was a rebellion, a statement carved in concrete and chaos. As the first ramps went up, the neighborhood started to notice. Curtains twitched, and a few kids pedaled over on bikes, wide-eyed and curious. Word spread fast, too fast. Less than an hour later, Corinne emerged from her house like a storm cloud, marching across the street with the fury of a woman who just realized she'd lost the upper hand. "What the hell is this?" she shrieked, jabbing a finger at the ramps, her face already flushing red. I leaned against a rail, barely holding back a grin. Oh, it's a private skate park, just a little recreational project for personal use. Nothing permanent, of course, that be against HOA guidelines. Her eyes narrowed, searching for a crack in my armor. You can't do this. The HOA has rules. I cut her off, pulling out the permit with a flourish. Actually, this is completely legal, city approved as a temporary structure, and since the HOA doesn't ban private skate parks, there's nothing you can do. She snatched the paper, scanning it with a scowl, her silence louder than any tantrum. I could see the gears grinding in her head, hunting for a way to fight back, but I'd beaten her at her own game, for now. Corinne's silence lasted about as long as it took her to crumple the permit in her fist and hurl it back at me, her face a mask of barely contained rage. "You think this is funny?" she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You're making a mockery of this neighborhood." I shrugged, unfazed, picking the paper off the ground. "No more than the HOA did when they blocked my driveway." Her jaw clenched so tight I half expected to hear a tooth crack, but she didn't have a comeback. Without another word, she spun on her heel and stormed back to her house, the slam of her door echoing like a gunshot. I knew this wasn't over. She'd regroup and come at me harder. But for now, I'd won the round. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the skate park sprang to life. Tony and his crew tested the ramps, their boards clattering against wood and metal, laughter ringing out as they landed kickflips and grinds. More kids trickled in, some on scooters, others on bikes, all drawn to the chaos like moths to a flame. Neighbors peeked out, some amused, some bewildered, but none seemed outright angry. If anything, the energy felt electric, a spark of something new cutting through the HOA's suffocating grip. The real victory came when a few other homeowners wandered over, people who'd quietly nursed their own grudges against Corinne's reign. Mark, a guy from down the street, leaned against my fence with a smirk. "This is genius," he said, nodding at the ramps. "Corinne's going to have an aneurysm." I grinned, watching Tony nail a rail grind. "That's the goal. If they won't let me have a driveway, I'll make the most of it." Mark chuckled, his eyes glinting with something like admiration. "You know, a lot of us have been dealing with her crap for years. Maybe it's time we push back." His words hit me like a spark to dry grass. If this skate park could wake people up, show them they didn't have to bow to Corinne's ridiculous rules, it was already worth every second of this fight. But Corinne wasn't one to go quietly. The next morning, I woke to a fresh HOA violation notice taped to my door, accusing me of unauthorized use of community space. I laughed so hard I nearly choked. It was my driveway, my property, and now they were claiming it as theirs. I grabbed a red marker, scrawled DENIED across the notice in bold letters, and taped it to the HOA office door, knowing it'd drive her nuts. Sure enough, Corinne was back by noon, dragging two reluctant board members in tow like a general rallying a defeated army. "You think you're clever," she snapped, waving the marked-up notice in my face. "I know I am," I shot back, crossing my arms, "and I know that fine's unenforceable." One of the board members, an older guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, sighed. "Corinne, maybe we should drop this. He's not breaking any rules." Her glare could have melted steel, but the other member, a tired-looking woman, chimed in hesitantly. "Honestly, I don't see the harm. The kids seem happy it's not causing damage." Corinne's eye twitched, her control slipping through her fingers like sand. This wasn't just about me anymore. Cracks were forming in her empire. "You might think you've won," she growled, her voice dripping with menace, "but this isn't over." I grinned, leaning back against the ramp. "Oh, I'm counting on that." As she stormed off, I felt a rush of exhilaration. This was only the beginning, and I was ready for the war she'd just promised. The grand opening of my private skate park wasn't just a win. It was a spectacle, a middle finger to Corinne's iron rule that drew a crowd I never expected. Word had spread like wildfire that there was a new spot free from the city's usual no-fun restrictions, and by afternoon, my once-blocked driveway was a buzzing hive of activity. Tony and his crew had called in half the local skating community, and skaters of all ages flooded in, their boards clattering against ramps and rails. Kids zipped around on scooters, bikers showed off tricks, and the air filled with the grind of wheels, laughter, and thumping music. It was everything I'd hoped for and everything Corinne despised. From her porch across the street, she stood like a sentinel, arms crossed, her face a storm of barely contained fury. Every few minutes she'd bark into her phone, no doubt dialing the police, the HOA, anyone she thought could shut this down. I watched her with a smirk, knowing I'd covered every base. She couldn't touch me, and it was eating her alive. Not even half an hour later, a patrol car rolled up, its lights cutting through the chaos. The crowd barely flinched, too caught up in cheering a skater landing a flawless ramp trick. I crossed my arms as the officer stepped out, scanning the scene with a mix of confusion and exhaustion. Karen strutted over, her triumphant grin practically glowing. "I need to speak to the homeowner," the officer said, glancing between me and the growing swarm of skaters. "That be me," I replied, stepping forward as Karen pushed closer, barely containing her glee. "This man, running an illegal business," she shrieked. "He's turned his property into a public nuisance. Look at this chaos." The officer gave her a weary look before turning to me. "Sir, we got a complaint about noise and an unauthorized commercial event. Are you charging people to be here?" I stifled a laugh, shaking my head. "Not a dime. This is a personal recreational space, free to use, no sales, no fees." I handed him the permit, my ace in the hole. "It's a temporary structure, fully approved by the city. Since the HOA blocked my driveway, I figured I'd use the space." Karen's face reddened as the officer skimmed the paperwork, her victory slipping away. But this is a violation of community aesthetics. It's not illegal," I finished for her, leaning back with a grin. The officer sighed, handing the permit back. "There's nothing illegal here. If it gets too loud, file a noise complaint, but beyond that, this is within his rights." Karen let out a sound, a guttural mix of a growl and a screech that turned heads even in the noisy crowd. "This is harassment." "He's doing this to spite me," the officer's expression screamed disinterest. "Take it up with your HOA board. Legally, there's nothing wrong here." With a nod, he climbed back into his car and drove off, leaving Karen fuming. She rounded on me, her voice a low snarl. "You think you're clever? This stunt won't last forever." I grinned wider. "Oh, I know, but I'm having fun while it does." She stormed off, her door slamming so hard her porch decorations rattled. Tony clapped me on the back as she vanished. "Dude, that was legendary." The party roared on, and as the sun dipped low, I realized this wasn't just my fight anymore. Neighbors were watching, some joining in, and Karen's grip on the neighborhood was cracking. As the sun set on the skate park's chaotic debut, something incredible unfolded. The crowd wasn't just skaters and kids anymore. Neighbors who'd silently endured Karen's reign for years trickled out, drawn by the noise and the rebellion it represented. Mark leaned against my fence, his smirk a permanent fixture, while Linda, an older woman from down the street, handed me a plate of cookies with a chuckle. "This is the most fun this street's had in years," she said, her eyes twinkling. "Keep it up, I think a lot of us feel the same." Her words sealed it. This wasn't just revenge anymore. It was a movement, a chance to wrest the neighborhood from Karen's chokehold. But she wasn't done fighting. The next morning, I found another HOA violation notice taped to my door. This one claiming my property was now a hub for delinquent behavior with fines attached. I laughed, tearing it off. She was flailing, desperate to claw back control, but her vague accusations had no teeth. The HOA's own rules were too murky to enforce this, and I wasn't about to pay a cent. Then came the escalation, an emergency HOA meeting. Karen had rallied her remaining loyalists, calling for an immediate vote to ban recreational disturbances in the neighborhood. I decided to crash the party, strolling into the clubhouse with a grin. The room was packed, board members slouched at a table, most looking exhausted. Karen sat at the head, tapping her pen like a gavel, her eyes locking onto me with venom. "This meeting addresses the growing disruption in our community," she began, her voice sharp. "One homeowner has created a public spectacle that degrades property values, invites undesirable elements, and disrespects the order we've worked to maintain." I leaned back, arms crossed. "You mean my personal skate park?" a board member sighed. "Karen, we've looked into this. He's not breaking laws." She snapped. "That's not the point. We can enforce community standards, and this abomination violates everything we stand for." Greg, another member, adjusted his glasses, his tone calm but firm. "Does it? I've reviewed the guidelines. He's not violating anything we've got written." Karen's eye twitched, her composure fraying. "Then we update the guidelines." I raised an eyebrow. "You'll rewrite the rules just to stop me from using my own property." "If that's what it takes," she hissed. That's when Mark stood, his voice cutting through the tension. "I think we should put this to a neighborhood vote. If we're making new rules, let's let everyone decide. This affects us all, right?" The board murmured, Karen's face paling as her plan unraveled. She expected to steamroll me, but now the power was slipping away. Greg nodded. "All right, we'll call a vote." Corinne's glare could have ignited the room, her jaw tight enough to snap. Fine, she spat, but don't think this is over. I smiled, casual as ever. Oh, I wouldn't dream of it. Walking out, I felt the tide shifting. Corinne was losing her grip, and she knew it. People were waking up, realizing they didn't have to live under her thumb. Tony clapped me on the back as we left. Dude, you just took down an HOA tyrant. I grinned, adrenaline pumping. And we're just getting started. The vote loomed, and for the first time, I saw victory within reach. Corinne had thrown every dirty trick she had, but she'd only dug her own grave. Now it was up to the neighborhood, and I had a feeling they'd choose freedom over her petty tyranny. Corinne's desperation hit fever pitch after that meeting, her carefully built empire crumbling faster than she could patch it. With the neighborhood vote looming, she doubled down, turning the HOA against itself in a frantic bid to crush me. Over the next few days, tension thickened like fog. Corinne went door to door, clipboard in hand, whispering to homeowners with that fake sweetness she wielded like a weapon. But every time she left a house, her frustration grew more visible. People weren't falling in line like they used to. Pushback was brewing, and it only fueled her resolve. Then the letters started, vague HOA notices landed in mailboxes, mine included, citing property aesthetic concerns and unapproved modifications. Mark showed up at my place, waving his own with a laugh. She's claiming my fence is an inch too high, same fence I've had for 8 years. I shook my head, amused but unsurprised. She's losing it, so now she's trying to scare everyone into submission. Mark nodded. She's targeting the older folks too, the ones who hate change, convinced a few that the skate park's the end of civilization. I expected petty retaliation, but the lawsuit was a curveball. One morning, I found an envelope taped to my door, the official letterhead screaming Corinne's involvement. Ripping it open, I read in disbelief. The HOA led by her was suing me for diminishing property values and creating a public nuisance, claiming my skate park caused emotional distress to the board. I laughed, shaking my head at the absurdity, emotional distress from kids having fun. Tony and Mark crowded around my kitchen table as we pored over it. This is insane, Tony said. No way she wins. Mark rubbed his chin. She doesn't have to, she's hopping, legal fees will break you. It made sense, intimidation was her game, but I wasn't folding. I called a lawyer specializing in HOA disputes, a guy with a grudge against corrupt boards. He laughed over the phone after reviewing the case. This is a joke. We're not just winning, we're humiliating them. That was music to my ears. The neighborhood watched the battle unfold, Corinne's years of bullying now under a spotlight. Her board allies grew nervous. Her invincibility was fatting, and the lawsuit, the resistance, the vote, it was all piling up. Then the bombshell hit. A former HOA treasurer came forward days before the vote, spilling dirt that changed everything. Corinne had mismanaged funds for years, unexplained expenses, vanished payments, unjustified fines. Board turned on her like sharks smelling blood, calling an emergency meeting I couldn't miss. The room buzzed with outrage as Greg dropped the hammer. Corinne, we've got records of missing money and personal expenses. This is serious. Her smug mask cracked, panic seeping through. She opened her mouth to deny it, but the crowd, homeowners she'd terrorized, had already judged her. Mark stood. I moved to remove Corinne from the board. Her head whipped toward him, fury twisting her face. You can't, Greg sighed. We can. The vote was swift, and she was out, the room erupting as she stormed off, slamming the door. This isn't over, she hissed at me. I smiled. Oh, I think it is. With Corinne gone, Greg turned to the skate park vote. It hasn't harmed anything. If anything, it's united people. Let the neighborhood decide. The battle's final act was here, and I felt victory closing in. Corinne had self-destructed. Now it was up to the people. As I left, Tony grinned. You took her down, man, I nodded. And we're not done yet. The day of the neighborhood vote crackled with energy, a buzz I could feel in my bones as people who'd never bothered with HOA meetings poured into the clubhouse. Corinne's ousting had lit a fuse, and for the first time, residents weren't just nodding along. They were ready to take charge. I stood at the back, arms crossed, watching the room fill up, Tony bouncing beside me like a kid on Christmas. Mark worked the crowd, rallying support, while Greg, now leading the HOA, called the meeting to order. The issue is whether the skate park on Mr. Jake's driveway can stay as a personal recreational structure, he said, scanning the room. Simple majority vote. Anyone want to speak? I stepped forward, every eye locking onto me, and cleared my throat. I didn't plan this. I wanted a driveway, not a fight. But when Corinne and the HOA blocked it, I turned a loss into a win. Look what happened. Kids play outside, neighbors talk, people connect. They say it lowers property values, but does this feel like a worse neighborhood to you? Murmurs rippled through the crowd, heads shook, some nodded. This isn't just about my driveway, I pressed. It's about our right to our own homes. If we let the HOA control everything, what's next? Karen fought this because she couldn't stand losing power, not because it hurt anyone. Mark jumped in, his voice steady. I thought HOA rules protected us, but they can be weapons. Karen proved that. Voting this down just validates her. The room shifted, doubt turning to agreement. Greg sighed. Let's vote. Hands shot up for yes first, a wave of support I hadn't dared hope for, then the no votes, fewer than I'd feared. Greg tallied it up. Majority says the skate park stays. Cheers erupted, Tony slapping my back as Karen's diehards slumped, defeated. I exhaled, the weight lifting. It was over. I'd won. In the days that followed, the neighborhood transformed. With Karen gone, people spoke up, pushing for rule changes, stripping the HOA of its overreach. Her allies quit the board, replaced by folks who cared about community, not control. Fines vanished, nitpicking stopped, and homes became personal again, doors painted bright, yards alive. Karen herself disappeared, first holing up in shame, then slapping a for sale sign on her lawn. The day she left, I watched from my fence as she shoved suitcases into her car, scowling. Guess you won't be blocking driveways anymore, huh, Karen? I called. She froze, fists clenched, then sped off without a word, her rain dust in the wind. Tony grinned beside me. Beautiful, I nodded. It really was. The skate park stayed, not just a hangout, but a symbol of defiance, a place where people unwound and connected. Mark and others reformed the HOA into something useful, and the neighborhood's vibe lifted. Home values rose, new families moved in, drawn by the community we'd forged. I kept the ramps and rails, Tony's delight, though I could use my driveway again if I wanted. One evening, as the last skaters packed up under a setting sun, I sat on my porch soaking it in. I'd moved here expecting the worst, and at first I'd gotten it. Karen's tyranny had been suffocating. But now, looking at this place we'd reclaimed, I realized something. What started as revenge had rebuilt everything. One petty concrete slab had sparked a revolution, and we'd come out stronger. I'd won more than a fight, I'd helped free us all.